I know the questions that I will be asking these people, but I don't know what they're going to say. So I am with you in attentiveness and finding out. These are not people I would call predictable in the narrow and bad sense. They are really full of interesting, well, their neurons are just very active, we'll just say that. So I'm so looking forward to hearing them. But before I say a few more words about the start, just a couple, I would like to say this is a student-initiated event tonight. Though it is not necessarily a student fully attended night, but that's a different story. So the students that we do have are unbelievably spectacular. So I would like to introduce first Dan Palken, who is one of the students who initiated this.
Is my mic on? It is. Okay. Thank you everybody for coming tonight. This is an event that the idea of it was had by myself and two of my friends, Mike and Kelsey, who are sitting in the audience today. I guess I should introduce myself first. I am Dan Palken. I'm a PhD student at the end of my PhD studying physics here at the university. And I work with a number of different political groups, and I kind of try to span my politics across the political spectrum. I'm a member of the Campus Republicans. I work with Citizens Climate Lobby very intimately as a conservative fellow and a leader of a local chapter in town. I am a member of the Students for Carbon Dividends Coalition, which is a bipartisan group of college students and graduate students working to fight for market-based climate solutions. Kelsey, Mike, and I wanted to have an event that was accessible across the political spectrum rather than the usual conversation about climate change, which often gets somewhat mired. So we didn't really know how to go about this, and Mike had the idea that we could approach the center of the American West, to which I said, what's the center of the American West? But we went and we walked into Patty's office, unannounced, and said, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to create a conversation that spans the political spectrum where everybody, all of you, will hopefully feel uncomfortable at times tonight and will hopefully feel comfortable at other times tonight, and we invite your feedback afterwards. And we expected to kind of have this idea shot down by the center, and this is unrealistic, we're not going to do that. And Patty said, this is a great idea. We should form a panel, we should put on a big event. And we're really delighted about that. So that's why we're here. And I want to sincerely thank all of you for coming. I hope you find this evening productive, and I'll turn it over to Patty to introduce us more formally.
Actually, so I am really delighted to have this occasion, and I would like to say that I'm so happy that I have decided to share my horoscope for today with all of the panelists. So it does not matter to me what sign you are, but I'm in the most hospitable way saying that our horoscope is speak up and share your plans and you'll receive encouragement. And in fact, I am the moderator and not the sharer of plans, so I figured it has to be yours. And then the follow-up is maintain a sense of humor. So here is a person in great need. There's a person in great need, and there is a almost as distinguished as our panel. They're not quite as distinguished. So that seemed like a good place of putting this. I will say I have had a day that I could have done without. I got a message from the Washington Post op-ed page asking me to write a column on what President Trump said about the frontier and manifest destiny at the State of the Union speech. So that is how I spent my day, moving very carefully on that invitation, and that is why climate change seems easy, It just seems like a much more manageable topic without anywhere near the horrors of trying to talk about the frontier in some kind of conversation with the president. So, okay, so that's how I spent my day. Everything is picked up. I think that the piece is going to run. I don't care a bit now whether it does or not. It's driven me mad. So it might be out there, it might not tomorrow, we'll see. So this is the group that I am so happy to be with, and our plan, the one thing I should say is that we have a couple of things that are a little bit distinctive. Everyone has they have a green card and a yellow card and a red card. And this we have found is a great way when you have really great panelists to get a sense of what they're thinking in relationship to each other. So you guys are to do this whenever you feel like it. If someone is saying something and you're thinking, yes, then you should hold up the green card. If you're thinking, I might agree with you if I could understand what you were saying, then you guys, or something of that order, I half agree, but I have some reservations, then you hold up the yellow card, and if you think, oh, good heavens, where'd that come from, then you hold up the red card. And then we can include you in the conversation after that. And it's a very responsible thing to have these 3 cards. It's really a serious charge to do that. So we will talk among ourselves. I do have questions that I will be asking them. And then everyone has cards.
I don't know if they all got them, but we have cards, question cards.
Okay.
Yes.
We have index cards, and we would ask you to write your question in as legible a handwriting. I didn't have the sense to bring my reading glasses this time, because some of you write in ways that are a little bit cryptic, runic or something that I can't quite understand. So, in any case, we will collect the questions. Kurt Gutjahr, our managing director of the center, will clump them and bring them to me, and then I will administer them to the group. One of our customs at Center of the American West is that if you are writing a question in anger and vexation, you should, or in delight and relief, you should note that emotion, and I will try to read your question in that spirit, which I, as a veteran of the former founding member of the original Banana Slug Theater at the University of California, Santa Cruz, the improvisational group, I really love that. If you will give me the signal on what you would like me to convey in tone, I'm totally happy to do that. And also, I think you deserve that. If you have feelings, we should be able to convey that. So, as always, we have Center of the American West Customs where we encourage protest and dissent, and we have just the one qualification that we would like you to use our custom of respiratory protest. So if you disagree intensely with something you hear, you should snort with contempt, you should gasp with disbelief, you could sigh with dismay, you can do any number of things, but you can't keep your neighbor from hearing the comment. So, but you can do a lot with the respiratory protest if you need that. In fact, you could, at this moment, you could hiss me if you would like for making that silly proposal. Okay, so keep that in your tool chest there. So our thought is that my time has been taken up here, and what we would like to do is have everyone, instead of my telling you their bios, which are in your programs anyway, but to have everyone begin, each panelist will provide a short self-introduction, including your role and professional history. And we will come back later to some of the other issues that have come up in your life journey, but just a quick, what should these people know about you in order to be as happy as I am that you're here?
So I will pass because I've already introduced myself. I'm Claudine.
Oh, well, I'd like to thank Patty and Dan for taking the initiative to bring all of you here this evening. And I always like to know a little bit about the audience I'm speaking to, because I never have a pat message, and I expected more college students. And so needless to say, I'm thrilled that all of you are here, but I feel like I don't need to light a fire under you to get the faculty to do X and the president to do Y and the chancellor should do whatever. But by way of introduction, I served in the United States Congress for 10 years. I was on the Science, Research, and Technology Committee. I authored the first and only Revenue Neutral Global Warming Prevention Act, which was an omnibus bill. And parts of the bill passed so that when you go to buy a refrigerator and you see the Energy Star rating, that was me. Regenerative agriculture, another part of the bill. So 10 years in Congress, then I was asked to teach leadership and policy development at Harvard, which I did. And then I was approached by 2 gentlemen to say, we want to start an energy efficiency and renewable energy business. We don't want to do it without you. I joined them. We had a 10-year exit strategy, sold it successfully. And then I moved out to Colorado because I felt my future is totally embedded with climate. And I need to be and work with a scientist here in Boulder, because I had been married to a scientist, and with all due respect to those scientists in the audience, you're not the best communicators. And that, I felt, was an important role. So in addition to that, I worked as a consultant, and I recruited 50 Fortune 500 corporations, including Ball and Coors and Roche and Citibank and Wells Fargo and a bunch of others to reduce their greenhouse gases. So I'm happy to report that even though when I first called them and said, what are you doing with your greenhouse gases? They said, I'm a bank, we don't have greenhouse gases, you know, call the coal plant. It's like, do you turn on your lights and heat and cooling? So at any rate, did that. And I also started a trade association for the photovoltaic solar industry saying, you guys have to hurry up, put solar on every roof, let's do a strategic plan and pick 10 states that have appropriate statewide policies to accelerate the expansion of it. So I have been working as a consultant, helping everybody from the Smithsonian to the Air Force to a bunch of corporations, utilities in England, and a variety of other things. But needless to say, you can tell from my delivery, I'm pretty driven on this topic.
Good evening, it's my pleasure to be here. I'm Tisha Schuller, I am a Leo.
Not tonight.
Yeah, Leos, yeah. Yeah, so you know I have a lot to say already, just right out of the gate. I'm a 24-year resident of Boulder County, so that tells you a lot about me right there. I have been an environmental activist, an environmental consultant, and then I did a 5-year stint as the president and CEO of the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, which is a challenging occupation if you live in Boulder County. I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about that later. 5 years ago, I left that job, and now I founded an a consulting firm to focus on de-escalating conflict around energy infrastructure development. We work largely with the oil and gas industry or with NGOs who are interested in working with the oil and gas industry. And a big part of that right now, of course, is focused on climate.
My name is Leif van Boven. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience. I have a less exciting career. I've been sent here at CU Boulder since 2002. I'm going to focus my comments tonight as much as possible on kind of my reading and knowledge of findings from the research literature. My expertise, my research lab studies what people think, what they feel, how they make decisions. We study people's stances on contentious issues, how they came to those stances, what might change those stances. We do a lot of experiments, we do a lot of large-scale surveys. So I have a lot of opinions. My wife is here, and she'll tell you I have a lot of opinions. But they're not always informed by the evidence. So I'm going to try to, for the most part, limit my comments to what the research tells us. But I also want to take some of Dan's time.
By all means.
So a few years ago, my friend and I wrote an op-ed. We were just recounting this before we started. We wrote an op-ed about political disagreement on climate policy. Dan wrote sort of a reply in another newspaper, and so that was picked up. We read the reply. He said nice things about us. That was wonderful. And he was such a compelling, good writer that we spent the afternoon looking up all of the other op-eds he had written. And it was just so beautiful and amazing to see this compelling communication about such important issues. And we talked about, who is this guy? We got to track him down. Then we realized he's a graduate student at CU, and we thought, let's get him to be a graduate student in psychology. And then we realized he's a PhD student in physics, and like the letters are the same, and the buildings are close, but they're really worlds apart. But it really is an amazing thing to see the impact of effective communication on these really challenging issues. So I'm privileged to be on stage.
My part of that story is that I ran into Leif in the underpass out here just after he had figured this all out. And Leif stopped me in the underpass to say, there's this amazing guy in physics who's writing these things. So I came onto that scene with my usual luck. I did not know that this great thing would happen where these young people would come into our office and ask us to do a project. So keep that coming when you socialize with your young folks. Young folks, how many are, well, okay, so anyway, young folks, make the case to come to the center and tell us the cool things you'd like us to do, because we just love having your coattails on that, and appreciate that very much. So we're gonna start with a two-part opening statement, and I guess we can go, maybe we'll start, since you didn't get to, because you already introduced yourself, why don't we start with you? What do you think is the most actionable thing we can do to get unstuck on climate change? So, Dan, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, so I think I'll start by diagnosing an aspect that I see of this problem. I think we often oversimplify climate to be just an issue of we need to do this one thing, we need to get off fossil fuels magically. But in the policy world, where I do a lot of my work in my advocacy, there's a lot of alternatives, a lot of trade-offs, and a lot of different solutions which appeal to different parts of America and different people. And America is meant to work at its best when people get out and engage their elected officials as much as they can. That's what it means to be in a democracy, and in particular in a representative democracy. And I always grew up admiring our political system for the wisdom that was instilled in how we divided powers and how we coupled the people to the outcomes, but in an indirect but impactful way. So I think when I think of what we can do, what I can do, and what others can do to move the needle on this issue, the general answer takes the form of having individuals engage their government. And I'll say a little bit about what I mean by that. Two of the groups I work with, the Students for Carbon Dividends Coalition and the Citizens Climate Lobby, do a lot of work in Washington, D.C. So I'm a bit jet lagged today. I flew back from Washington yesterday, where I was in D.C. talking with other conservative members, other Republican members, and independents and libertarians of our organizations, to members of Congress on the right side of the aisle. I had 5 different conversations with 5 different offices. And they were productive conversations. We got a sense of where offices were on various issues. But there was one of the meetings in which I was very emotionally moved. One of the women we had brought with us, who was a businesswoman from Colorado Springs, spoke about the fires that her district had experienced, spoke about the droughts, spoke about the wood kill that they've been experiencing up in District 5. And this was a meeting with a very engaged staffer who I've met with before, and I've never seen him so silent and so attentive for so long. And going beyond just the issue of climate and what we were advocating for, it was beautiful to see a citizen bringing her personal concerns in a way that was very sincere to our members of government. And I think a lot of people, when we think of climate, we think of getting out in the streets with a protest sign. When I think of action on climate, I think of building up kind of my set of skills and going into the institutions where these decisions are made and having conversations and figuring out what people in power are being told by their other stakeholders, and trying to move the needle from inside the system in this way. I think it's a very beautiful thing if you're able to try to engage in our democracy this way. And I think this is the most actionable thing, empowering people to realize that as citizens of this great country, there's a lot we can do to engage our government in ways which are productive within the system and effective.
I was supposed to mention that the League of Women Voters is here. And so anyone who is thinking, well, that makes sense, but I better check my registration, that can so happen here. So thank you, Dan, for that. And thank you for reminding me that, Representative.
Yeah, and I told the ladies from the League of Women Voters, it's their fault I'm here, because I said, I thought we were going to be speaking to a lot of students, and if these students are not registered to vote, I'm going to be very upset. But they're here, and if you do need to register, thankfully you have the opportunity to. What's the one thing that we can do? Well, I think that it's hard for me to just say one thing, but I think most importantly, if you want to change a person's mind, whether it's your legislator or your nephew or whomever it might be, the most important thing to do first is to listen. And the second thing is to know more than they know about climate. This sounds pretty simple, but I can't believe the number of people that go off trying to pitch something and they don't have all of the facts. The other thing is that when you're going to make your case, I think it's useful to think in terms of pleasure and pain. And Professor, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that if you were to synthesize all of the elements that move people it pretty much falls into two broad categories, pleasure or pain. So I used to do some running, and if a coach would say to me, oh man, you're sloughing off, and man, you're looking weak, that wouldn't move me at all. But if somebody said, you're looking great, you're gonna make it, you're terrific, keep going, that would move me faster. So we have to understand the person that we're speaking to and what is it that actually moves them. In addition to that, I think it's real important to have a serious conversation with your children, with your grandchildren, with your friends. And that conversation needs to focus on setting targets and timetables for yourself, because every individual does make a difference. We are all collectively part of the whole, but each one matters. Just as in the voting process. Oh my gosh, we know how many elections have been won or lost by just a handful of votes. Well, it is critically important to make sure that you are making your case with more knowledge in a way that the person will actually hear you and leave no stone unturned, because we are in crises management right now. And for those of us that have been working on climate for 30 years or more, you can understand how it's a little frustrating, and I want to just scream, Rome is burning, or pedal to the metal or something, but it means that each of us need to reassess what I do in my daily life and what can I do better to impact climate. In addition to changing another person's mind, it's your own lifestyle change. And that also includes speaking up at every opportunity you're given. Stop there.
My most actionable is a personal opportunity to leave behind the language of vilification and looking for a bad guy in the climate fight. And this is really challenging because it's a call to each of us as individuals with macro implications. If we have a problem of a global scale that requires all hands on deck, then we probably shouldn't be spending so much of our time pointing at villains and creating an environment where it is nearly impossible for them to come to the table. And what this sounds fine in the abstract when you think about maybe letters to the editor or articles in the newspaper, but what I really spend a lot of time thinking about is how we actually make that change in our own hearts, which makes room for everyone to come to the table and be a part of the solution. And then the second part of that is that then allows for the complexity of the solutions that are required, which aren't just about turning things off or getting rid of things or doing less. There's a real complexity that's required, that's going to require us to understand and acknowledge that we need more people at the table.
I have two things as well. So I think there's a prevailing narrative in the United States that the reason that we can't make headway on climate change is because of Republicans, because of conservatives, because of the widespread skepticism. And if you look at the data that's been collected over the past almost decade now, that's just really not true. So it really, well, I think we'll get to this later, Patty, but it really is the case that a very clear majority of Republicans, just like Democrats and Independents, recognize the reality of climate change, are concerned about climate change, and think that humans could do something to solve it. So to have this continued narrative that a large group of people are just wrong on this issue, and it's their stubbornness that's preventing us from making headway, is not only itself destructive, but it's also incorrect. It just doesn't stand up to the facts. The second suggestion is that for many of us, the question is really, how do we become the kinds of citizens we would like to be? So we have values, we can articulate what it means to be a good citizen, but yet we often find ourselves kind of pushed around by these social pressures, by these political pressures, and we don't always realize this is happening. And so it's a much more productive conversation to think about how can we help people be the kinds of citizens they would like to be? How can we make it easier for them to do what they would like to do, to help them become part of the solution, instead of trying to convince them that they're wrong and we need to see things our way? And those are my two guys. That's it.
In fact, I wanted to, this sums up, because I wanted to throw this in at some time, that Lynn Jurek, who was interviewed in the New York Times, she is the chief executive officer of the residential solar company Sunrun, which is the leading installer of residential rooftop solar panels. At the start of her interview, she says that she starts every morning with the mantra, "All people and all circumstances are my allies." So, okay, I forgot to cards. Okay, and we just, I so value Leaf's social science work, and it's so wonderful and so inspiring. And I'm just going to say this I'm just going to say, I hope you were right about what you just said, and you usually are. Yes, okay, good. So, okay, moving on. All right, so moving on to our next question, which is for each of you, and maybe we'll start with you, Tisha, this time. What is the most underrated factor, least noticed in the stuckness when we are stuck on climate change? What is the factor that we, in our long list of what is going wrong and what should be changed and so on, what is the thing that actually is consequential but the least noticed and most underrated factor in the stuckness?
I love this question. So I think the least underrated factor that we're all participating in is a limited vision of a decarbonized world that's wonderful, that's amazing to live in, that is where people can be raised out of poverty, where we aren't called to give up something every day, a little more. The language and the solutions that we articulate in this pretty narrow black and white climate fight are about stop doing things and giving things up. But there's actually incredible opportunities with technologies and evolution and raising people out of poverty that we in the world can live better than we are today. And with a vision like that, and of course allowing people to come to the table, we have something to work on. It's hard, it's complex, we will have to do things differently, we will have to innovate. There will be sacrifices, but we can have a world that's better, and I work in this space full time, so I'm not just being a weird Pollyanna, which I also am, but that's not what this comment is about. We have to have a vision that people want to be a part of, and you said, I think, pleasure and pain. I say love and fear are what motivate people, and let's create a vision that is more driven by love, love of life, love of humanity, love of prosperity. Right on. Yep.
I'm not sure I was supposed to I may not be legitimately holding these. I may be moderate, but how could I not take that up? So, Leif, do you want to go next on that one?
Sure. So the most underrated factor, the most underrated factor is the power of identity politics in the way we talk about and reason about climate change. And when I say identity politics, I really mean the identities that we all have as liberals, conservatives, Democrats, and Republicans. That there are these really powerful but often invisible forces that shape the way we think about the climate problem. So I want to just sort of do the thing that professors love to do and tell you about a study, because I think it actually speaks to how these things play out. So this was a part of a research project that we did a couple of years ago with nationally representative samples, and we described to people exactly the same type of climate policy. One of the policies we used was a revenue-neutral carbon tax that Dan might have more to say about later. And what we did is we experimentally manipulated whether the policy was described as a Democratic policy or a Republican policy. So we just said this was a Democratic idea, Democrats like it, or we said this is a Republican idea, Republicans like it. And what we saw among ordinary citizens is that for Republicans, they actually like the idea when they think it was a Republican climate policy. They didn't like it so much when they thought it was a Democratic climate policy. In fact, they were pretty strongly on the negative side. And Democrats were the same way. So this is not a Republican issue. This is a Democratic this is bipartisan partisanship. So Democrats love it when they think it's a Democratic idea. They don't like it when they think it's a Republican idea. So this simple party identification, this kind of towing of the party line, happens even when you're talking about exactly the same idea. And what we've since discovered is that the way this works is when the political elites, when the political leaders espouse some thoughts about climate, that's really sending a signal of what other people in our political tribe believe. So when there's a very prominent Democratic leader who says we need this comprehensive climate policy Green New Deal, that sends a signal that says people like us think this is the solution, and by the way, people not like us shouldn't agree with this solution. And that creates a really powerful social context, a social norm that people become worried about going against others in their tribe. They become worried about disagreeing with other people who they care about belonging in the same social tribe. So these identity politics are very, very powerful, and people really can't see that this is happening to them. They feel like they're reasoning carefully through the issues, but what they're really doing is reasoning in a way that supports maintaining these kind of tribal divisions. And so we have to recognize those psychological realities, those social realities, because those are fundamentally what we need to overcome.
I'd just like to add a footnote, seeing as how I served in government, working on what today is a controversial issue, and it is divided by party. But when I introduced my bill, I had 140 co-sponsors, Democrats and Republicans. In addition to that, at that moment in history, there were such things as moderate Republicans. Today, they're not, in office at any rate. And when I was in office, we had 29 of us that were the swing vote. We were the power, because sometimes we voted with Democrats, sometimes we voted with Republicans, but we didn't pay attention to who was introducing it. Rather, we asked the question, is this in the best interest of all the people? We never asked, will we win? I think that this is what the voters now have to demand. And just FYI, 4 years ago, I knew we were going to be in this situation, just listening to the campaign rhetoric. And I formed something called Republicans for Integrity, which is a group of Republican former senators and House members, like myself, that are very frustrated with the labels. You know, my God, if you're a conservative and I'm a moderate, we can't talk to one another anymore? Well, it's true, we can't, because during the last 2 weeks, I arranged for 2 separate delegations to go and speak with the senators about calling for witnesses. And those senators didn't want to hear from former senators and former congressmen. So this is a different world that we should not accept under any circumstances, because our democracy is at risk.
That began as one of the most underrated. It finished as a really recognized and forceful point. So thank you for that, Dana.
So I think when it comes to underrated aspects of the problem, there's a lot of interesting aspects of the problem, but one that jumps out at me is the role of random chance, or nearly random chance, things that are very hard to predict politically, that depend on kind of accidents and elections that go one way or the other. And we tend to construct narratives for ourselves as people living in our political system that are determined or even over-determined. You encounter people in the climate space. Some people believe, or in any number of political spaces, that things can't possibly change in a direction that they're looking for, because whatever powers are arrayed against them are too much or too great. But in actual fact, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned specifically in the history of climate legislation. For those of you familiar with the Waxman-Markey bill and the history around that of 2008 to 10. This is very exciting. So, this was in the 2008 election, John McCain and Barack Obama ran on similar climate policies. They both ran on a cap and trade proposal. So you can critique this proposal. It's not perfect, but they both ran on similar climate positions. But of course, the Democratic Party was seen as the more climate-oriented party, and when Obama ultimately won that election, it was very hard for Republicans to politically cede that ground that that McCain might have naturally led the party towards in a pro-climate platform at that historical moment. I view that as an interesting irony, because a lot of Democrats wish if only more Democrats were in power, we would have all the climate solutions we want. In actual fact, a lot of people argue, and this is also contested, but a lot of people argue that if John McCain had won that election, we would have comprehensive market-based climate policy at this moment. Nonetheless, he loses the election, and in the next 2 years, climate policy is negotiated with McCain as part of the discussions, with Lindsey Graham as a major player, John Kerry, Joe Lieberman, who was at the time an independent. A bill was passed through the House of Representatives with some bipartisan support. And then in the Senate, it was being worked on by Lindsey Graham, by John Kerry, by Joe Lieberman, a Republican, a Democrat, and independent. And all of a sudden, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill happened. And it was all of a sudden the trades that were happening. There was going to be some offshore drilling that was going to happen as part of an overall program to draw down emissions. Were no longer seen as viable by the Democrats, and Lindsey Graham dropped off the bill. And it was introduced by Kerry and Lieberman to no great reception, and it was yanked out, and no climate policy was passed. Now, the Deepwater Horizon event is notable as an environmental catastrophe in its own right, but it also actually, at this moment in history, changed the bipartisan conversation around climate change, and it wasn't some grand plan of some omnipotent and malevolent power. It was just an accident of history. So when we look back at how we've gotten to the point we are, I think we over-partisanize it, as Leaf says, and I think we also over-determine it. And that might sound like an argument for, oh, it's all chaos and we shouldn't care, but it's actually it has a very different implication in my mind. I think the implication of this, taken seriously, that chance really plays a role, is that we're kind of always on the margin of being able to enact policy in this space, and what policy we will get really depends on who the people acting at the forefront of this movement are. So I have serious policy preferences in this space. I like, as Leaf said, a revenue-neutral carbon tax, one that reduces emissions gradually but quickly enough, according to the scientists, that has some measure of bipartisan support and that doesn't grow governments. These are my personal political preferences. And so I involve myself in the conversation because I have a high degree of faith that kind of with the pinballs of chance bouncing all over the place, there may eventually open up a political window where this sort of policy is viable one day. And the more and better organized people in that space are, the more likely it will pass. Now, anybody in this audience, you can all disagree with me, think this is a terrible policy, have your own policy that you like, but I think democracy works when people engage on what they believe in. And so the point here isn't to persuade you that because things are chancy and uncertain, we should all support Dan's favorite climate policy. It's to persuade you that you should view yourself as empowered to get involved and support your own beliefs. Because windows do open up, they're unpredictable, and they're important to take advantage of.
So now we're moving to, we have 2 or 3 questions before we get to audience questions, but the first one after our opening statements here is, how did you get where you are today, your perspective on these issues today, and what is the principal thing, an experience, a study, possibly a study, an article read, a comment made by a friend that got you to the perspective that you have today on this issue of climate and responses? We haven't started with, Leaf, why don't we start with you, because then we'll start with the framework, which you don't want to really be in because you don't really want to talk about yourself and your position that much, but.
Do you want my whole personal history? No.
Very detailed. No.
This is not a particularly dramatic or interesting story about how I sort of came to think about these questions. My interest as a researcher is really in understanding what it's like for everyday people just to experience life. What we think about the social world, how we feel in the social world, how we make decisions. I've looked at questions like what makes people happy in life, why pursuing life experiences makes them happier than pursuing material possessions, how we underestimate the power of embarrassment and social anxiety, how we signal identities through the kinds of consumer purchases we make. So, lots of interesting topics. And I guess about a decade ago, there was a meeting convened of behavioral economists and psychologists. It was a small meeting, and the goal of the meeting was to just discuss what we might have to say about climate change and climate solutions. And all of us who were part of that discussion, I think, realized that solving climate change is not really going to be a simple technical solution or a simple policy solution. That there are these really complicated, powerful social dynamics that climate change people refer to as a wicked problem that involves all of these entrenched systems, economic systems, political systems, psychological systems, natural systems. And where is the role of people in those systems? And we kind of realized that if we're going to solve climate change, it's really a question of behavior change. It's really a question of societal change. And that means that social scientists, social psychologists like myself, have some relevant expertise, and in fact, I would argue an obligation to apply that expertise to what is really one of the most pressing issues of our time, if not the most pressing issue of our time. So, it's easy when you're a tenured professor, you say, you know what, this is more important, I'm going to shift my attention and really work on grappling with this problem, and that's what happened. And it's amazing once you shift your orientation and start engaging deeply in these problems, you realize that you actually have a lot to say. You have a lot to contribute to help people, as I've said earlier, just be the kinds of people they would like to become. You start meeting interesting folks, like the folks on this panel. They help you understand better the nature of the problem, and it helps you better identify potential solutions. So it's not interesting necessarily, it's not dramatic, but it really has affected my worldview of what it means to be a responsible social scientist, to really address the important questions that we face.
And on another occasion, I would want to ask you how normal you are as a social scientist and having that structure, but I'm not going to be pushing.
Yeah, okay, so let me add. Well, first of all, no, I'm not normal. It's a relief. Yeah. So none of us on the stage are normal. It's... Among social scientists, among people in my field, there's a relative minority working on issues surrounding climate and climate solutions. And there are any number of reasons for this, but I think one we have to acknowledge is, many of us rely on federal grants to support our research. And we live in a world now where you cannot use the words climate change and secure federal funding to support your work. And so if you want to do the work, you kind of have to slip it in under the radar and identify other related issues. But it's a little bit like examining questions related to gun ownership and gun violence, that it's just very, very hard to do that kind of work in a way that is supported by the federal research infrastructure. And given the realities of that situation, yeah, I'm a little bit unusual, I think.
So I loved what Leif said earlier about the invisible forces of our social identity, because I've been bumping up against these invisible walls and I didn't know what they were. And I'll tell you about the time I ran headfirst into one. 25 years ago, my spectacular husband, who's here in the audience, and I were raising our 2 kids up in the mountains of 4 Mile Canyon in a log cabin with cloth diapers and homemade baby food and homemade yogurt. And you can be sure there was no pesticides anywhere near our house or GMOs, and the children weren't vaccinated. So you get the picture, right? So you got the social identity. And I was reluctantly permitting a gas storage facility as part of my environmental consulting job, which had me driving 6 hours to Northeast Colorado about once a month to do field surveys. I had come to love this landscape over about 2 years. And then 1 month I went out and there was a massive wind farm that had gone up as far as the eye could see. And I found it disturbing and disorienting, and it broke my heart. And I loved wind and didn't like gas, and I was permitting this little 1-acre gas storage facility, but there was windmills as far as the eye can see. And I know a lot of people feel like, well, wind farms to me are beautiful, and you can have that opinion. For me, this wind farm was distressing and disturbing, and it made me question everything. Well, if I was wrong about this, what else have I been wrong about? And then I went back and started doing calculations about the energy density of natural gas and the space that wind takes up, and on and on and on. And then once you start questioning one thing, you have a choice. You can either not question and say, I was wrong, it was beautiful, or you can question everything. And now I support GMOs, I vaccinate my children, I love people of the oil and gas industry as my dear friends, and I am devoted to climate change, addressing climate change as well with all of these partners and all these contradictory statements. And I'm so glad I understand what has been alarming me for so long.
I guess mine is dramatic because my entry into climate change was started when I was 25 years old, and the doctors told me I had lymph cancer and a 50-50 chance of surviving. And that was like running into not the invisible wall, but a brick wall, thinking, well, wait a second. I believe my parents taught me that everyone is on this earth for a purpose. And I hadn't figured out at age 25 what my purpose was, so I thought, I better hurry up and figure it out, and I can't possibly die until I do figure it out. So every morning, afternoon, evening, I would do a little mantra or prayer, and it was essentially help me understand, why am I here? Because I do believe that every individual is important. And so one day my new husband comes home and he says, I think I'm going to run for office. Well, I was in the radiation days, I was totally zoned out and bald for the first time. And I said, well, cool, I'll help you raise money, I'll help organize the volunteers, whatever you want, dear. And then he came back, long story short, he said, no, I'm not gonna run, but I think you should run. And I just laughed, and it's like, there we go, women doing the dirty work again. I really laughed it off, and I said, you gotta be kidding. I hate politics. I'm much more global in my worldview. And then two other people came along, and they said, we think you'd be great in office. And I thought, get out of here. And then I said, wait a minute, is this what I'm supposed to do? And it seemed pretty clear to me that was the answer. However, the reporters laughed at me because they said, you have no experience, you've never held any political office, you have no money, you have no name recognition, and the registration is 15 Democrats to every 1 Republican. Well, when my husband and I moved to Rhode Island, we became Republicans because at that time, all the Democrats were corrupt. And we thought, whatever they are, we're the opposite. So we thought, Teddy Roosevelt, Abe Lincoln, Republican Party, this is fine. So at any rate, I get to Congress, I'm excited, I'm on the Science, Research, and Technology Committee. The scientists come into the hearings and they start talking about there is a possibility that we could be experiencing a warming of the planet. Well, of course, I'm all ears and paying attention and taking notes, and the second year they come in and the third year, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I've got to do something about this. And I told my staff, and they said, you got to be kidding me. Nobody knows what global warming is. Nobody knows about climate change. And I said, well, isn't that why I'm in office? It's my job to educate them, to inform them, to wake them up, and to pass legislation that will help prevent climate change from happening. So they were reluctant, but I immediately went back to my constituents in Rhode Island, and I said, look, there's a very good chance that we are causing the acceleration of climate change, and we all have a responsibility to do something. Fortunately, even though in those days constituents were not as attached to Republican and Democrat, or I should add, it took me twice to win. First time I ran for the first office I ever held for Congress, I got 48% of the vote, and everybody said, oh, it's a miracle, it's a miracle. Well, I worked my buns off, and I'm pretty strategic, and I felt I need to communicate. And I remember a gentleman saying to me, I don't agree with you on all your issues, but I'm going to vote for you. And he was shaking my hand, and he wouldn't let my hand go. And I said, oh, well, if you don't agree with me on the issues, then why are you going to vote for me? And he said, because I trust you. Unfortunately, today, people don't even look or ask themselves the question, do I trust this candidate? Because if we paid more attention to the person's trustworthiness rather than to their party affiliation, we wouldn't be where we are today. So I got into climate by listening to the scientists, by feeling I am in this position for a reason, and I have to fulfill my purpose, and that is to serve the public. And so that's what I did, and happily, there has been progress. We haven't seen it on a national policy level, and in contrast to a little bit of what Leaf was saying, I'll take another second to say Republicans for Integrity did an analysis just focusing on the Senate, because the House has already passed some climate legislation. As a matter of fact, the House has passed 400 bills, and they're sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk. But right now, 19 out of the 20 largest recipients of fossil fuels are the most vociferous opponents of any climate legislation. They're all Republicans, 19 out of the 20. And my bottom line is follow the money. I'm sorry to say, this is a different world, but you know, whoever is paying you, that's where you react. And when I got elected, I said from the outset, I'm not going to take money from big oil. And the next thing I know, some guys come to my office in Washington and they said, we'd like to make a contribution. We represent, you know, the mom and pop operations of oil. And they begged me to take their money. And I said, well, you have to understand, just because I'm taking your money, I'm not going to necessarily vote the way you want me to. And they said, oh, no, we're not attached to that. So sure enough, when the time came, I voted in the way they did not support, and I didn't get their money the next time. So money right now is very detrimental to the political process.
Could you just remind us of the years in which you were taking this up?
80 to 90. Those were the Reagan-Bush years. And both President Reagan and George Bush Sr. were supportive of my legislation. They weren't outwardly vocal, but, you know, I got Reagan to sign my legislation in an international treaty on biodiversity. And everybody said, wow, how'd you do that? Well, listening, communicating, educating, and explaining the value proposition of what a difference that would make. But it's a different time politically now, and that's why we all have to be very politically engaged. This November, it's not enough just to vote. We need the League of Women Voters engaged and watching the polling booths. A bunch of my friends that served during the same time, Tom Ridge was the head of Homeland Security. Porter Goss was the head of the CIA. He was my buddy from Florida. Who was the third one? Another one, Dan Coates. Oh, he just resigned. Dan Coates, was the head of the intelligence agency. And I just met with them the last time I'm in Washington, and they said, Claudine, you got to keep doing what you're doing. And I said, you guys need to speak up now, because you were in those positions of national security, and this election is critically important.
But a funny thing to say to you, you've got to keep up what you're doing, as if you would ever do anything else. It's just a little bit of reality in that. So thank you, Dan. Yeah.
So my answer to this question, in the tradition of Leafs, is much more dry and boring. I am a physics grad student. That wasn't the boring part.
Physics grad student, come on, people.
That's the exciting part. It gets way worse. I'm a physics grad student. I've always cared about politics. I'm new as of the past 3 or 4 years to the climate arena, and the way this sort of shaped itself and happened was I had felt very concerned about this issue. I felt very concerned about a lot of issues in our politics and I don't neatly sort into either political camp. So you can imagine the 2016 election distressed me a lot. I was seeing things on both sides of the aisle that I felt could be done a lot better. And around that time, or a little after, it was actually my friend Lindsay, who's sitting in the audience there, who told me about an organization that she was working with that was seriously bipartisan about climate. I've mentioned it, it's the Citizens Climate Lobby, and I showed up kind of, well, okay, I didn't just go to a meeting. I told Lindsay that I wasn't interested. And Lindsay told me that I was interested, and I said that I wasn't interested, and the argument continued like this for a little while, 8, 9 months, 10, 11. I went to a meeting, and I discovered that these were really, in a sense, my people. These were people that cared about the issue more than they cared about the politics of it. So when I got involved with that group, I felt like I had a space that I was empowered to operate in. And this is where we come back to my being a physics graduate student. I'm privileged to work in one of the top physics institutes in the country, in Gilla, right down the road here. CU has a very good physics program, and I'm very honored to be a part of it. And within the physics community and within the science community more broadly, there's a deep concern about the issue of climate. Not because everybody who's a physicist has carefully vetted this issue themselves, but because the people that have speak with a fairly united voice on it. And there are colleagues, we know they do their work carefully, in the same way that anybody here knows that their most trusted colleagues does their work carefully. And I felt that the scientific community was selling itself short on its ability to message this. Scientists in general really do not like talking to large groups of people. They like turning knobs and not looking at lasers, but tuning up lasers and testing devices and making incremental improvements and witnessing the beauty of the universe and creating things that people can use. And no part of that is going out and having contentious conversations with large numbers of Americans who vehemently disagree with you or don't see a way to action on something. And fortunately, I do like all those things. I don't get too deep a pleasure out of them, but it's something that I feel comfortable doing and I feel a calling to do. In particular, and this is the really boring part of the story, because my research is, even by physicist standards or even by scientist standards, where progress is always incremental, mine is particularly useless. I research dark matter, which, if you don't know what that is, physicists don't either, so don't worry. But it's a mysterious substance that makes up most of our universe. You can try to convert it to normal matter. It's very hard. If you do, you'll succeed in discovering it, which would be a big scientific discovery, but probably wouldn't help anybody's life for the next millennia. And so I got involved. When I got involved with the Citizens Climate Lobby, it kind of met many of the things which were missing in my life personally. It met the desire to do something that impacted people more. It met the desire to empower myself politically. And it met the desire to speak up on behalf of colleagues who many of whom felt the same way. And so I felt very engaged in that space, and that was my journey into the climate space.
Wow.
Such a misstatement about the boringness of it, but partly because of the way you made fun of other scientists, which we all enjoyed very much. That was really a pleasure and not boring in the least. So I guess for the next, we have 2 more questions, so maybe move kind of fast on this next one. Maybe we could just do this almost not in yes or no things, but do we actually know we're stuck? Do we have the wrong premises about public opinion? Are the people really whoever the people are they that knowable? Do we know that they're stuck? And when we are saying the word we, what's going on there? Who are we speaking of when we say we are stuck? And maybe we are attributing something to a bunch of people who actually don't have that vision of themselves as a stuck group of people. So, maybe we'll hold you, Leaf, because I think you have data, which we don't want to have in the picture just yet. So we'll back on that. So just a quick response from the three of you. Do you think we are actually stuck, and who is the we in that stuck?
I'll save the part about the we for someone else and just use all my time to answer the first part. I think the question of whether we're stuck is actually an interesting and more nuanced one than we give it credit for. There are meaningful error bars on the statements that climate scientists make. Now, this isn't to call into question the science itself or the general direction of the statements, but whether we end up with a 3 degrees warmer world or a 2 or a 1.5 or a 4.5, these are not something subject to certain emissions reduction scenarios that scientists are willing to make extremely concrete statements on, because scientists don't make extremely concrete statements on things they aren't extremely sure of. And so the question of whether we're stuck, it might not be as bad as we said, as we think it is. But why am I up here advocating for climate action if that's the case? Because I naturally see this issue through a lens of risk. Climate change presents itself as a risk to me. It's, it could be less bad than we think, in which case perhaps we're overreacting. But it could be much more bad than we think, conversely. If you're willing to acknowledge one, you're probably willing to acknowledge the other. And there's no situation in life when maybe you're walking onto an airplane and somebody tells you, oh, the airplane has a 1% chance of crashing, and you believe this, but you're not going to get on that airplane. In the same way, the numbers when it comes to climate are actually considerably scarier. So the chance that that it's really truly benign and there's nothing to worry about, in my mind, are fairly low. The chances that it might be somewhat bad are still low, and the chances that it is quite bad are worth considering and high. So there's room for uncertainty in the conversation, but we often mispeg the uncertainty as well because we don't know we shouldn't do anything. That's precisely the opposite approach that any business would take to risk. The approach any business takes to risk is, well, if there's a really bad outcome on one hand, which is that we don't act and the problem is actually really bad, versus if there's a mildly suboptimal outcome on the other hand, we act in a way that reduces emissions and we affect the numbers for climate plans of the sort that I look at. The numbers are we affect GDP by on the order of maybe 1%. That's a real serious outcome, but it's not the same as the kind of tail end predictions of how bad climate can be. So to the question of whether we're stuck, we might not be, but we should act as if we are reasonably stuck, because that's what a kind of risk assessment would tell you to do.
I'm going to keep my comment very brief, with all due respect to the questioner, and that is, I don't have time to ask the question, are we stuck? And none of you should take the time to do navel gazing. We all have to look in the mirror and figure out, how can I make a difference? I'll give you a couple of examples of what I have done in the course of a day. I go grocery shopping. I walk into Safeway. I said, hey, I thought you guys were 100% wind energy because I remember seeing a banner there before. I want to see the manager. I asked to see the manager. Are you guys still getting 100% of your energy from wind? He said, oh, I don't know. And I said, could you check that out for me, please? Because if you aren't, then I'm going to change grocery stores. I mean, people need to speak up and take action, and everybody is moving too slowly when we look at the seriousness of the challenge that we're facing. And I think that one of the most important things that I want to leave all of you with is that you're either part of the solution or part of the problem. And you have to decide, which are you? And if you're just treading water, then, we're not moving further towards solutions. So that's all.
I love this question of stuckness, because when I'm here, I end up speaking in some way, sort of representing the oil and gas industry. And tomorrow night I'll be in Calgary, speaking to the oil and gas industry, where I'm the kooky liberal from Boulder, and I have to explain what all you people are thinking when I'm there. And then I have this other world that I live in, which is if you're any of you familiar with the Breakthrough Institute, which is a lot of research and about pragmatic solutions to climate change that transcend all of these divides. And so I feel like there's a lot of slipperiness of potential. I'm not the physicist, but I really want you to talk to me about what could happen when there's just a lot of shaking happening at the stuckness. And so I feel optimistic. Now tell us what's wrong. Tell us how it is. I got my red card ready.
Patty threatened me that I have data. And I do have data, but Dan had error bars, which is...
They better go together.
Yes, we're wrong about what other people think about climate change, and we're wrong in really important and destructive ways. Are we fundamentally stuck? Hopefully not, but many of us believe that we are. Many of us treat this as a fight between people who have the right idea versus the wrong idea. And those kinds of beliefs will probably just get us more stuck. I want to return to this point, especially among conservatives, among Republicans. There is this misconception that they don't care about climate change, that they're not concerned about climate change. And I'm talking about the ordinary person here, the ordinary voter. I'm not necessarily talking about the politician. And the problem with that misperception is that it, first of all, creates this false social norm. So now other Republicans who have this misconception worry that, well, if I voice concern about the climate, do I still get to be in the group? And that's really hard for people to deal with. A second concern about that misconception is that it leads Democrats to think of the other side as the enemy. And that is just as destructive as not sort of empowering those on the conservative side. So are we fundamentally stuck? Probably not, but if we believe that we are, then beliefs become reality. And so I think the challenge for, one of the challenges for social scientists is to correct misperceptions about the way the world is, and this is a really powerful opportunity to do that, because we know if we kind of break these misunderstandings, then we can break these destructive cycles. And there are error bars around those statements.
Yes, I would agree.
Good.
So I think what we'll do really quickly is just in a sort of lightning round, and then we'll get to the audience questions. What approaches can we use to disarm, engage, recruit, and enlist people into action together rather than demonize, confirm terms of antagonism, divide up further, and sort of willfully error bars or not go into further stuckness? So, quick.
Yeah, so I think the best tool we have here is honestly a deep conviction, which we should all hold, but most of the time we forget to, that our fellow Americans are approaching things sincerely and genuinely. And I've yet to meet a person who I've assessed gets out of bed in the morning and asks themselves, how can I harm the world today? I think this is very rare. And I think, and I say that and it sounds obvious, but it's treated as very common in our politics. And I'm not just talking about how we treat politicians, I'm talking about how we treat each other. And I've seen that on the climate approach, talking to people significantly to the left of me, talking to people to the right of me, the single tool that I find most reliable and helpful is a near certainty, until proven absolutely otherwise, that the person I'm talking with is having a conversation in good faith, in line with what they believe in, and their convictions on how to make the world a better place.
The question is, what is the technique or the method or the approach to recruit, disarm, build alliances without the demonizing and further dividing and further enhancing stuckness?
I think to keep it short, to lead by example and to share your joy at how happy you are that your electric bill is teensy or that you just bought an electric car, whatever it might be. But I think leading by example at this moment in time is absolutely critical. And of course, speaking to your family and friends and making sure that everybody votes.
So, two things. Tell me about why you feel that way is a great conversation continuer, rather than let me tell you why I think you're wrong. So tell me about why you feel that way. Tell me about where you got your information. I want to understand what your perspective looks like. And then, and only then, are you interested in another opinion? And if they're not, then keep it.
I cannot stress enough how strongly I agree with what Dan suggested about affirming that other people are well-intentioned and are really trying hard to do the right thing. That when it's just a bedrock principle of not just persuasion, but communication and relationship formation, that we really have to honor that other people care about other people, that they care about the world, that they're really trying their best to do the right thing, even if we see things differently. That's a critical first step, the most important thing we could do in these acts of communication. I would also add that we can invite people to think about the legacy they want to leave. We can invite people to think about how future generations will look back on the actions they're taking today and whether they are on the right side of history or the wrong side of history. And really think about what does it mean to you to be a good citizen and how can I help you enact those values. You don't have to see things my way, but how can I help you act on the values that are most important to you?
So, sorry. Okay. So a couple of questions here that are, you may feel you've already done this, but maybe a little bit more here. I'm not sure. Actually, this one I think is the one we haven't really gotten to. In response to the villain comment, I'm put in mind of the idea that if everyone is blamed, then everyone is blameless. And yet there are certain fossil fuel companies that need to be held accountable more than your average citizen. What are your ideas for how to be allies and advocates for fossil fuel industry workers while still ensuring that oil and gas companies are held accountable? And that's open.
Sneaking suspicion that's it.
It's very possible, yeah.
So, fortunately, I'm unburdened anymore by being the spokesperson for the oil and gas industry. So I give you my personal opinion, which is that there are, of course, oil and gas companies and actions of oil and gas companies that need to be held to account, and more transparency and more improvement, et cetera, et cetera. So I believe that. What I would say in a room like this is that oil and gas companies are producing a product that the public is demanding with almost no tolerance for its disruption or its price increase. And so there's this really ironic situation where we're saying, give us this thing and never let it stop and never let the price go up. And you're evil for doing what we're doing every single day, and you need to change what you're doing. And by the way, we don't want to talk to you because did we mention that you're evil? So what I would say about that is, and I love this idea of, because I haven't been able to articulate it, of people waking up. I actually have to tell people in the oil and gas industry that environmental activists are waking up feeling they're on the side of right because they feel so under attack by a holy war that they don't understand. We're just doing what we're supposed to do. We're just doing what's demanded of us. So I think the premise of the question is wrong. I think the opportunity is to create a table where oil and gas industry executives and employees can come, and I will tell you that I have met the CEO of every oil and gas company you hate, and they are lovely people who want to do right in their hearts and believe that they are. And so we have to make room for them at this table. And when I spend my evening tomorrow night saying, come to the table, and then I promise you there are times they come to the table and no one will meet them there. And so I think that we need to take more responsibility for our role. We can demand improved metrics, we can demand more accountability, more transparency, but we are part of the problem. We might even be the problem. We need to just join forces to look at this together.
The only thing that I would object to is the notion that there is any profession where everyone there is a lovely person.
How do you know that's there are exceptions.
Well, I don't know where you're going to go.
There are no
okay, let's not go there. So now we have questions that these three are really quite wonderfully related. I'll just present them and they will come together for you. But we begin with, in your judgment, are anthropogenic causal factors or astrophysical, geophysical factors the dominant causal agents driving climate change? So is it anthropogenic, or are things just underway, Earth-wise and atmosphere-wise? How should, and then following up on that, kind of building momentum here in a huge way, how should climate deniers be dealt with? Listening to them is not enough if we listen attentively to that. And then, in our midst, I don't buy the premise of climate change. Change my mind. A citizen.
Well, do you want to start?
Sure. Okay, so I guess as the closest thing to a climate scientist on stage, but I'm not that close, I will talk to the in your judgment, what is the cause question. But this is, in my judgment, the cause is there are both natural cycles and there are anthropogenic causes. The anthropogenic causes are the dominant cause of the warming temperatures that we are seeing right now, according to the vast majority of the scientists. It accounts for roughly 90 to 110% of the warming we're seeing, and I give that bound as over the 100% mark because the fluctuations could actually go in the opposite direction. And so we could actually be experiencing a partial natural cycle of cooling while experiencing more anthropogenic warming than is indicated. That's the scientist's answer, and I'm only here to quote it for them. I don't think there's much nuance to add to that. The other questions were how to deal with deniers, and I don't buy the premise of the problem change my mind. Is that?
There's one person asking how to deal with deniers, but one of them saying, this person did not characterize himself or herself as a denier, but said, I do not believe in climate change, convince me.
So I think the most convincing answer I have to that is the framing I put forth of risk earlier. If you believe there's even a 5% chance that this statement I just made about the scientific consensus is correct, that is reasonable cause for action in the same way that if there was a 5% chance that I was on an airplane yesterday, they're terrifying. I hate turbulence. If you believe there was a 5% chance your airplane was going to crash, that would be enough impetus to do something. And so there is actually room for, I'm not encouraging this attitude by any means, but if somebody is not convinced, it's a long conversation to walk somebody through a very sophisticated world of data, and that's probably not the answer, because it's probably hard to acquaint somebody with, frankly, the climate science data is hard to penetrate for somebody even out of field and in a similar field, such as myself, I found. But a better answer is to say, there is room for uncertainty, or for people who feel uncertain about this, to still say, under a framing of risk, it is still a very rational and intelligent thing to want to act on that risk. So I would kind of invert the question. I would kind of change the question or change, the premise, and say I'm not entirely sure it's necessary to fully convince someone to bring them into the fold of this conversation.
So I had a very interesting experience coming over here today. I decided to take an Uber, and when I got into the car, I saw that on the screen of the radio or whatever, it was Rush Limbaugh program. And I thought, So the driver said to me, so where are you going at CU? What are you doing there? What are you speaking on? And I said, climate. He said, oh, that's interesting. And I said, well, I see that you're listening to Rush Limbaugh, and I know that at least I can only speak for him, but he seems to think it's all a hoax. And I said, what do you think? And so he asked me the question, is it man-caused? Is it natural cycles? And I said basically the same thing. It is both and. And it's important to get as much information as you possibly can. So he proceeded to ask me a whole series of questions like, well, isn't the situation with plastic waste and, hazardous waste sites more serious? And I said, well, not necessarily, because this is a global challenge. And then he went into, what about China? And I said, well, you know, China is essentially a dictatorship. And right now, the Chinese policies are, we are building every building as energy efficient as we possibly can. I said, we're not doing that in the United States. He said, but what about the big picture of our national economy and our competitiveness? He didn't use the word competitiveness, I did. But I said, same situation. I said, we have to keep in mind that in this country, it's market-based, more laissez-faire. And I said, I'm a Republican, and I certainly am not a fan of big government, but the fact of the matter is that the science is real. When thousands of scientists all around the world have come to an agreement, it is real. And he said, well, how do we make a difference? I mean, he had many questions in that short ride. And in the end, he got out of the car and hugged me. And he said, you really gave me a lot to think about. And I have to tell you, when I got into the car, I had just gotten off the phone, and I was sort of in that mode of, I can't believe what's going on in Washington, you know. And so I got in the car and I saw Rush Limbaugh, and I thought, okay, this is my test. Just get into a space of loving kindness and everything will be fine. And sure enough, Matt is a lovely guy. I'm a little nervous since he knows my name and phone number now, but we had a good time.
I think this is the right transition to this question from that one. What role does religion play in individual opinions about or disposition towards the issue of climate change? Hasn't figured in the conversation yet, except a little bit with this whole...
I'll take that in a left turn, which is that climate in many ways has become a holy war and a religious war. And to segue back to the last question, I write weekly for the oil and gas industry on this topic. And what I find is that leaving the paradigm of deniers is the first step to making any sort of headway, which means leaving the idea of the holy war about climate behind. Because I suspect that I make more progress with people who don't believe climate change is real or needs to be addressed by being an ally and by sharing my perspective and by looking for language that we can understand together. So when I talk about climate, for example, I often use the metaphor of a hurricane off the coast and how we prepare our infrastructure. I know the irony of doing that, but that's a metaphor that the industry can work with very easily. And then we can really get to talking about climate commitments, climate solutions, and so that doesn't specifically address, but I think we have to get away from this idea of righteous conversion and switch into more of a meeting people exactly where they are. You can clap, I'm only
I guess I want to add a couple of observations. First of all, I won't bore you with the details, but there's a lot of work in psychology of persuasion and communication that tries to understand how highlighting the relevant moral foundations, the religious values, is really an effective way of getting people to take action. And I think we need to appreciate that people do have genuine religious values, moral foundations, and really think about what the implications are of those values for how we address climate change. The one other point I would add was a couple of responses to some survey data that we collected with a certain citizen lobbying group that I won't explicitly name, but I think we admire. And one of the questions we asked people was about what makes it difficult for you to lobby effectively to enact climate solutions. And there were a number of people who said, in this community, as an evangelical Christian, I feel embarrassed and ashamed about what other people might think about my religious beliefs, and so I can't articulate them in the way that I really want to in order to take action. And I think for people in that situation, we really need to ask ourselves whether we've identified the most common identity and solution that we're trying to enact, and whether we are inadvertently creating these barriers that make some people feel unwelcome. That's not going to help us in our cause.
It seems hard to think how religion couldn't be a big factor in the notion of sin and redemption. For that, it just seems like there's so many. Sorry, I'm going off on that, but it just seems like that really is a force, and I know there's a lot going on in studying that. So moving on. So markets. There's a couple of questions here about business and markets. The conversation is largely focused on policy. To what extent do you think that market solutions are nonpartisan and potentially more effective in the near future? And related to that, Claudine and Tisha, you both work with business to be part of solutions. What message do you tell them to motivate them to be allies? So markets and business and...
Sure.
Pretty good. Okay.
It's primarily, my message is first and foremost, asking them about their energy usage and educating them as to how profitable they could be were they to use less energy. And so when I was doing this work, recruiting corporations to sign a contract with EPA to agree to reduce their greenhouse gases, I basically explained to them that their particular company had maybe 5 or 6 greenhouse gases. Reducing carbon wasn't necessarily the most important move. And so it was a matter of, this is how much money you could save. And it was primarily an economic argument. So that is what moves businesses. They want to know that it's going to save them rather than cost them. That is also true for the average consumer. I want to make sure that if I'm putting solar on my roof, it may be upfront money, but I'm going to save money in the end because the sun is free. Or if I'm buying an energy efficient refrigerator, yes, it may cost more than the piece of junk next to it, but I'm going to be saving money. So the economics is terribly important to not just business, but to everybody. And in terms of markets, yes, markets are great, and that's what's carried us so far. But that's not to say we have to do, once again, either or. We're in a crisis situation with climate, so we have to do both and. We need policies, both state and local and federal, and we also need, individual actions on the part of corporations, universities, and individuals.
So risk is the number one motivator that I use because you can talk about it in very dry language that is very effective. So, and you're totally onto something that I use to great effect. And I'll just introduce one new idea into this discussion, which is that there's so much great data about millennials, politically, millennials, economically, millennials, and the workforce. And talking to the industry about how to retain and mobilize their millennial workforce is something that is piquing their interest. They understand it to be an external risk. They understand it to be an internal asset. And mobilizing millennials within the oil and gas industry is super energizing for me, for them. So that's just a whole nother, we could have a whole talk about millennials in the oil and gas industry.
Actually, some of the questions are about that, okay. So, but not quite there yet. I guess where I want to go, and I know that we're getting very short on time. Oh, please, yes.
I would like to talk about market-based climate solutions. So as kind of a background, I didn't know any of this when I got into this space, and so I'll share like a 1-minute spiel for others. But climate solutions at the federal level fall into kind of several categories. They fall into either the subsidization space. So government comes in and says, we view these technologies as promising. Contrary to that, they can fall into the regulation space. Government comes in and says, we mandate less of this. And contrary to that, the third option is market-based solutions, where the government puts a price through some mechanism, and there's details there, that on the emission of fossil fuels, and is then technology agnostic and lets the markets with a new price signal sort out how to lower emissions subject to that. The question of whether, one important aspect of this problem, which was raised in the question, is whether these are more bipartisan. I think objectively, yes. You see support among these from, the support is not big enough on either side of the aisle yet collectively on both sides of the aisle to have passed such legislation. Although, as I said in an earlier answer, we came kind of close in 2010. But some of the leaders in this space include 3,500 economists who span the political spectrum, who authored a letter in the Wall Street Journal last year in 2019 saying carbon pricing, and in particular one scheme where you just give the money back to consumers, was the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions. You had, to speak on the Republican side of this, you had Greg Mankiw, who was the chief economist for George W. Bush, but on the Democratic side, you had Janet Yellen, counterpart or the chairwoman of the Fed under Barack Obama. So you had a broad bipartisan consensus there. You have people like James Baker and George Shultz, who were secretaries of state under H.W. Bush and under Reagan, who are actually two of the chief champions of these market-based solutions. But it's hard in Congress. I'll give you the perspective from inside lobby meetings, which is where I spent my day 2 days ago in Washington, D.C. And I can't go into details of what's said in specific meetings. The Citizens Climate Lobby takes serious the confidentiality when we speak to Congress people. But the general sense among staffs, we were just meeting with Republican offices on this day, was there's a deep skepticism in these offices of the solutions that the left champions very vocally. So there's a very deep skepticism in these offices, and it's very unlikely in my diagnosis that they'll be persuaded anytime soon to support, for example, the Green New Deal. There's a healthy skepticism, and in some offices, an actual support among the staff who vets these policies and looks over them of the market-based solutions, but they're not certain the constituencies are there yet. I will not steal Lee's thunder because I think he has a point to make about kind of uncertainty in what would happen if there was a large-scale effort among conservatives to. I might have just made the point for you by saying that you had that point. But okay, so to make the point, there's a degree of uncertainty that social scientists have about what would actually happen politically if Republicans moved forward as a body and said, we as a group, not just a few of us, there are actually a few Republicans in the House of Representatives and in the Senate in the past few years who have endorsed major pieces of carbon pricing legislation. But what would happen if 200 of them did this is kind of an unknown politically. It would be an interesting intellectual question if it wasn't one I was so invested in emotionally. So, yeah.
Right. And I certainly know that that's something we needed to hear you talk about, and I thought I was actually going to tee you up this a little with this question about young people and the potential appeal of what you've been speaking of with that solution. So here's several that are put together. How do you convince more young voters to be active in the existing political system so many of them care about climate change? How do you leverage that into the political sphere? And is that solution you were just speaking of, is that one of those ways? How do we get the younger generation more involved with climate change? Then a question for you, is climate change skepticism common among younger people? And if so, what lobby group could be driving that? And then a very fine, this is when I get to read in a mood, the mood is feeling frustrated. I'm an environmental studies student and a registered Democrat. I'm genuinely glad to hear from a group of Republicans that care about climate change and are working to fight it. I'm 19, I have legitimate concern for the future. Honestly, if Republicans care about climate and my future, why can't there be bipartisan support for climate legislation on a national scale? Why aren't conservatives making their own Green New Deal, in quotation marks around that, solutions? In my eyes, a safe future is bipartisan.
In my vision, it is bipartisan too, but we have to understand the real political dynamic here at this moment in time. And the reality is, as you just saw this past week, it doesn't matter what the facts are. What matters is partisan allegiance. And that is very disconcerting. So my feeling is that you go for wherever you can get results. I'm also happy to say that not only am I on the board of the Citizens Climate Lobby, but I'm also on the board of the Climate Exchange, which is a state-based carbon fee and dividend organization, and they just passed a carbon fee and dividend through the Massachusetts State Senate. Now, if we can get more of these moving through the Senate, maybe the federal government will get the picture that this is something that we want. But I will also tell you that I spoke to the Republican governor of Maryland, and I said, what's it going to take to get this legislation moving through Maryland? And he said, when my constituents are there. So the bottom line is to educate the masses, and corporations have a strong voice. That's why I wanted to put my energy behind the corporations to carry the message that, hey, Microsoft is carbon neutral. You know, IBM is going gangbusters, so is Staples, so is Target. So for young people to have faith at this moment in time in a bipartisan solution, when it comes to the Senate, in the next several months, don't hold your breath. I maintain that it is absolutely essential that we change the Senate. They are sitting on legislation, and they will do. And this is no longer, as far as I'm concerned, about party. So one of the things that I'm suggesting, I'm also part of a group, some of you in the audience may also be, I'm not part of it. I am arm's length away from it, but it's the Citizens Climate Leadership Coalition. It's made up of all different kinds of environmental organizations that are focused on climate here in Colorado. There are a bunch of bills here in Colorado now that have been introduced that will reduce our carbon footprint. So young people have the opportunity to find out what these bills are, go to Denver and lobby on them and let your voice be heard, because you can be part of the solution right here at home.
So this darned audience is only asking good questions. I'm just going to say that if you could just write some nonsensical, pointless questions, that would make my life a lot easier here. So, but if you wanted to respond on this one, okay.
I want to respond to the comments about what the constituencies think, what sort of ordinary Democratic and Republican voters think about these different policies. So first of all, there's a lot of support just at the sort of average level for these revenue neutral carbon taxes. And people, it's a simpler policy than the sort of command and control cap and trade type programs, so they enjoy greater levels of support. I was describing earlier these kinds of experiments that we've done where we can manipulate whether the policy is presented as a Democratic or Republican policy. So we can kind of run that simulation to see, well, what would happen if Republicans actually took leadership in proposing climate policies? And there's a pattern that I think we have to really grapple with. The Democrats are much stronger in general in their support for climate policy. So both Republicans and Democrats are a little bit on the support side, but Democrats will tend to support it kind of no matter what. It may wax and wane depending on where it comes from, but they're on the support side. Republicans in the aggregate are kind of spanning that support-oppose boundary. And what seems to tip it is whether they view the policy as being a Democratic or Republican policy. So if you just look at the polling numbers in these kind of experiments, policies that come from Republicans enjoy more support among both the total of Democrats and Republicans than policies coming from Democrats. And I think if you really take that seriously, it implies that you need to have Republican leadership proposing, advocating, really taking ownership of climate solutions. And without that, given the current realities, it's going to be hard to get a lot of the average Republican to go along. So tell the Maryland governor to step out and take a lead, and people will realize we all have this concern. Exactly. I'm on board too.
I just want to add one footnote that is related to that, because the Republicans are preparing, because they're scared to death. They're seeing the numbers, the polling numbers on climate, and 73% of the American people are alarmed, concerned, or very concerned. Only 27% are dubious about it, or question it, whatever. So Republicans are paying attention to the voters and their concerns about climate. However, here's where the greenwashing comes in. The proposal that the Republicans are talking about in the Senate is throwing more money at innovation, including clean coal, nuclear, one of the most expensive options. And the reality is, spending money or throwing money at a problem is not going to solve the problem. The carbon fee and dividend is a much more efficient way to address this. So just to say, we're going for new innovation. As a Republican, we're talking about more deficit spending. And on top of the last tax cut and the permanent tax cut for corporations, from a fiscal point of view, we've got a serious problem. And I also want to share that the Federal Reserve made it real clear that of their top 3 risks, since we've been talking about risks here, the Federal Reserve has declared climate as one of their top 3 risks. So, Wall Street and the markets need to be paying attention to that too.
So, yes. We're out of time. Really close to getting out of time. So if you could speak in telegraphic brevity here.
This is like a long and nuanced point.
We can't tolerate that right now. So we really are going over time, and I will just ask the one that's the only one where I have a reason. Are there any historical examples of major social changes that can be used as models for moving forward with global warming action today? Yes, there's hundreds of them. I mean, there's abolition, there's any number of things. There are things that seemed absolutely intractable. If there was ever a more intractable problem, was that there was slavery and it was built into the Constitution and so on. And yes, there are things to look at, and I'm going to cut myself off because I cut you off, but absolutely, what a fighting question. And climate change is extremely urgent. How do the solutions you propose address that urgency by 2030?
Yeah. If you put a price on the emission of fossil fuels of $15 per ton and raise it by $10 per ton per year, you'll see a quick downtick in coal, a short uptick, and then a gradual decline in natural gas use and a slow decline in oil use. By 2030, you'll have reduced fossil fuel emissions, economists project, by about 40 to 50%. By 2050, you'll be about 90% of the way there. The money doesn't have to be used to grow government, and it can be given back to the people. These are the market-based solutions I'm talking about that draw some meaningful measure of bipartisan support. And it's in line with what scientists talk about when they talk about when they talk about keeping us to 1.5 degrees of warming, let alone 2.
Okay. I think that you threw me off, Dan. Yes, the situation is urgent, and actually, I think all of you have already gathered, I'm very much of a pragmatist, and I also understand the urgency of the situation. So while a carbon fee and dividend I embrace wholly, I also am realistic in looking at the people that we have in the federal government and what happens if we do not have a veto-proof Senate. And I look at risk assessment and various scenarios, and so my feeling is we have to work on all fronts, whether it's the federal front and the state front and the local community and our own homes and families, so that unless we feel at the end of the day like, yes, I'm leaving this planet better than I found it, I have done everything I could possibly do. And let me tell you, there is no time for skepticism or people who are cynics. And this is the time for optimism and a can-do spirit, and we can get it done. But it's going to require absolutely every one of us and every single strategy that we could possibly employ. There is no silver bullet at this moment in time in order to get us where we need to go.
Are you looking for a closing statement or an answer to the question?
I'm looking for those in one package.
Okay, got it. So we'll put it together. Science tells us that apocalyptic narratives do not mobilize people on climate. I also genuinely believe in adaptation and human ingenuity and an optimistic future. And I spend my life studying these things, and there are plenty of scientific-based cases to make for a future that is not apocalyptic. With that being said, then what mobilizes me is to make the case for incrementalism, for compromise, for baby steps, for things that aren't stuck but are moving us forward. And by having an all or nothing narrative, by not being willing to take small steps at a time, I think we would condemn ourselves to a stuckness. I would instead propose a relentless optimism and a willingness to do things one step at a time with people we don't particularly care for.
I think we underestimate the power of incrementalism. That we underestimate how quickly social systems can change dramatically.
Yeah.
We underestimate this on the downside for sure. We're not always ready for how quickly we can descend into an authoritarian regime, just to take an example that we might worry about. But we also underestimate how quickly positive change can happen as well. And I think part of what we are trapped in is we're having a conversation about should we have a climate policy. That's what the political debate is now. If we enacted any policy, that changes to something like, how effective is this policy? Is it doing what we want? And once we start having that conversation, it's much easier to make changes. Incremental becomes substantial, becomes a real sea change. And so that's where we need to start.
Senate of the American West has its own little customs, and this is a very special occasion for us because it was so student-driven that I just sat in my office and I heard some people saying, we were wondering if the Senate of the American West could help us, which is all that people of my age want to hear from young people. Is there a way we could help? I love the phrase, okay, boomer. I like it very much. And I see it as a generational olive branch that has kind of got a sharp point whittled into it, but I just am so happy to have been that boomer who got to hear that. And the selection of our panelists that we have is so spectacular. So the Senate of the American West custom is when there's an occasion like this, it has to be a standing ovation for this group.